Good evening. You're listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. 36-year-old Wayne Adam Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriffs Office in Northern California with a woman's severed breast in his pocket. He ended up convicted of the grisly torture and murder of 4 women, confessing to police because he couldn't stop himself. Based on previously sealed testimony and interviews about the key players in the case, Body Parts is a frighteningly intimate look into a twisted man overcome by the horror of what he had become, powerless to resist that ever-increasing perverse sexual and murderous desires within him. With unprecedented access, my guest author, Caitlin Rother, reveals what exactly drove a troubled man to commit such unspeakable murders. Body Parts with author Caitlin Rother. Welcome to the program, Caitlin Rother, and I hope I'm pronouncing your last name properly.
It's actually Rother, but that's okay.
Okay, well, now I'll go on from that. Caitlin Rother, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, first off, what made you decide to write about this case? It is a particularly shocking case. What was it that compelled you to decide to write this incredible story? And finally, what unprecedented access did you have? What information did you have that you were privy to?
Okay, let me start with the first question. It's funny, but I've always been fascinated with serial killers. There's a program on MSNBC that features an interview between Jeffrey Dahmer's parents.
I've seen that.
Seen that? I just get riveted when I watch that. Even if I've already seen it, I'll watch it again.
Yes.
But I never really thought that I was going to necessarily write about this, because to spend this much time in such a dark place, I knew was going to be difficult. But
sure.
Like watching an execution as a journalist, I thought it was something I wanted to do and should do if I'm going to write about this type of thing. So I actually decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do this one. But the specific reason I chose this case was that, it was grisly, but that he turned himself in. And I think that's it's not unprecedented, but it's pretty rare. And
sure.
The fact that he walked into the sheriff's office with this breast in a plastic bag is a pretty shocking detail that
sure.
always makes people say, oh, wow, I want to know more. So it wasn't that I wanted the gruesome and gory stuff. I'm not that type of writer. I'm really more interested in the psychological types of cases.
Sure.
So this book is really a psychological look at this guy and his life, and how did he evolve and become this person who, did these horrible things, and what did he end up doing about it to stop? So.
Yes, and they did talk about the unprecedented access. So I just wanted to know. I mean, the book is incredible in its detail, and it covers every aspect of it. So you were privy to information
right.
via that access. So tell us what specific
sure.
people or players you had access to.
Okay. I went up. I did not go to the entire trial because I didn't know about the case until the very end of the trial, and I learned that he had been convicted. So I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go up for the death penalty trial, because there's, in a death penalty trial, you have the guilt phase and then you have the penalty phase.
Right.
So I went up for the penalty phase to San Bernardino County, which is a couple hours northeast of where I live here in San Diego. And I met all the players in court that day, and I went up to them and said, I'm interested in writing a book. Would you be willing to cooperate with me? And pretty much everybody in the courtroom that I talked to, the attorneys on both sides and the judge, and I got to know the clerk and found out, that I could actually look at some of the interviews that had been done, which became part of the evidence. And some of these interviews the judge would not admit, but they were still put into the evidence.
I see.
The jury did not get to hear these things or see these things, but I got to see them. Does that make sense? So there was an interview with his mother, for example, that ended up not being presented in court, which was fascinating and really telling. And there were other interviews with his family members that nobody had ever heard from. But I built on that by gaining the trust of the defense investigator, who talked to the father and the brother of Wayne Ford and told them they had never been interviewed by anybody other than police and by the attorneys. So they'd never talked to the media. Apparently Dan Rather approached Gene Ford, the father, and he said no. So somehow I managed to get exclusive access to family members, both through my own interviews and I spent 2 days entire days in a hotel room talking with Gene Ford and Rodney Ford. So quite a lot of really interesting background information that was never revealed before.
Yes, I mean, you really cover the subject of this book and really get to his background and really cover both sides, which I thought was very unusual for most books where they didn't have access to that kind of information. So you gave both sides, and rather than trying to make a decision based on your own opinion, you just presented both those sides. And that gets me to this next question. The subject of your book is Wayne Adam Ford, and he goes by the name often Adam. Right. So what was Wayne Adam Ford's childhood really like?
I want to talk just for a second about this middle name thing, which I've sort of gathered just, it ran in his family. His mother and his brother and his father all went by their middle name, but I think in Wayne Ford's case, I think he really wanted to be somebody else. He didn't like who he was. That's just my personal opinion, and I think he wanted to use this other name, not just because his other family members did that, but I think there have been other serial killers who have done that as well, including the one that I'm just finishing a book up about now. He actually changed his name legally. So I don't know if that's something that many serial killers do or not, but I know of at least 2 that I've written about who've done that. But anyway, Ford's childhood was pretty complicated. His mother had deep depression, depending on whether you believe her, whether you believe Wayne's defense psychological expert, 2 suicide attempts, one of which she did in the kitchen in front of Rodney by cutting her wrist with a can, I guess a can lid, when you open a can and you have the sharp edges. I think that's what she used. And she denied it to him, but, he was 8. He could still tell what was going on.
Sure.
She saw things in a very different way. When as you may probably noticed in the first part of the book, I could not write it the way I normally did, where I could say authoritative, this is what happened.
Sure.
Because the Gene Ford had a very different version of events than she did.
Exactly,
and he claimed that she was just living in this fantasy world. Anyway, she was very sexualized. She was having affairs. Her husband, Gene, who was in the criminal intelligence in the Army, was away a lot. So she was, lonely and whatever else. Had an affair even with her husband's 15-year-old brother while he was away. And, there's some theories that, someone in Wayne's situation growing up around that sort of situation doesn't know what to do with the anger and all the sexuality going on in his mother, and so he ends up acting out like this. The father was a pretty dominating character, very big and tall man, gruff, and I think inside he was probably nicer, but he comes off pretty hard on the outside, and Wayne was really scared of him. So his father would spank the boys often, but more often apparently Rodney, because Rodney was the rambunctious one. But Gene was so scared of him that he was fighting with Rodney, and the fight was broken up, and he knew that when his father came home he was going to get in trouble for fighting again with his brother, so he went and hid in this car out in a field, and he was so scared of what his dad was going to do when he got home from work, he literally passed out in the car from fear. So when his father pulled him out, he basically was passed out. He had to put him over his shoulder, bring him inside, and tell his brother to go get him a drink of water. So it was pretty strange. So Ford was a very sensitive and emotional child, really took things hard and held on to his emotions, and always wanted to be around his mother and was clinging to her skirts a lot, but she did not show him any affection. She even admitted to this later on. and said, I should have told my two boys that I loved them. I know that now, but I didn't at the time. So he, wanted affection, didn't get it from his mother, and was very dependent on her. She did a lot of things for him. Even his teacher mentioned this to her. You shouldn't be doing so much for him, tying his shoes for him, who knows what else, because he's not able to do these things or feels like he should do these things for himself. So I think a combination of probably inheriting, a genetic predisposition to some mental illness. He had depression as well. At least the defense psychologist believed that, although the prosecution expert did not believe that. He also developed borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder basically manifests itself such that these people really take abandonment very hard. So they get very attached to people, and then they see them in very black and white terms. So they love them one minute and they hate them the next. And that pretty much bears itself out. And I'm very familiar with this personality disorder because I was married to someone who had it, and I lived with someone who suffered from this. And it's, they could be the sweetest one minute, and then the next minute would change, and it could be really very emotional, and took things, sometimes distorted things. So anyway, that's basically this borderline personality disorder is generally thought to develop in the first 5 years. So I think a lot of what was going on between, his mother and his father, they fought a lot, they weren't getting along, the sexualization of the mother and the aggressiveness and dominating character of his father really contributed to Wayne turning out the way he did. So genetics, nature, nurture, I can't say which is really the cause. It's been an age-old debate, but I think that we can see a combination of those factors in him.
Yes, certainly. I mean, certainly, there's the argument because we get to our next question about his older brother, Rodney,
right?
And you do talk about that. For all intents and purposes, at least Rodney believes, and maybe you might even believe that Rodney turned out well. But you do go to great lengths to talk about that Wayne seemed to be a fragile,
right,
even at a young child. So let's talk about Wayne's relationship with his brother Rodney, because it is really important and very, very significant later on.
Right.
What was their relationship really like?
Well, they were very close growing up because they were moving around a lot, and there was a period where they actually were in Okinawa together and living on a military base, and with a depressed mother who didn't get along with other military wives. They must have been pretty miserable in that house, especially with the fighting going on with the parents. And as I detailed in the book, whether or not there was a gun in the house and whether there were threats, whether she really did feel in danger or whether she was just, fantasizing and making this all up. It sounded like a crazy place. So even though they fought with each other and competed with each other as many brothers do, they grew close, and they stayed close throughout their lives. But more than that, there was a special kind of twisted relationship that they had where Wayne would do something wrong and then confess to his brother because he knew that his brother would tell on him, or that he knew his brother would do the right thing and make it right. So when Wayne stole some items from a sporting goods store when he was a teenager, he showed the stash to his brother in a closet because he knew his brother would do the right thing and basically turn him in, essentially. And Wayne had this strange fear of punishment, and yet he felt like he should be punished. Right. So there was also an incident where he went off. Neither his mother or father ultimately could deal with him, and so he went to go live with a relative, one of his father's brothers, Jimmy. And he ran away from home and figured that he had broken the law and actually went to juvenile hall, or started making his way towards juvenile hall to turn himself in because he knew he had done something wrong. I mean, and that really plays into what happened later. But so when it came time, that he felt like he couldn't stop himself from after killing these 4 women, and possibly more, we don't know. Some of the detectives on the case believe there are more victims out there.
Sure.
But after these 4 that we know about, he said he just didn't want to do this anymore, and he couldn't stop, and he was worried about killing his ex-wife. So he called his brother and again said, I need your help. I don't want to hurt people anymore. And Rodney didn't know what the hell was going on. Actually, he didn't tell him that initially, but he got him to come. I really need you to come down here. So Rodney drove actually up there, up into Northern California. And then once he got there, he told him he wanted to turn himself in. And Rodney said, okay. So, but he wanted details, and he couldn't get details. So, but again, they have that dynamic from when they were younger, and
right.
And then it still played up until the very end.
So he couldn't get any details from him, but he was convinced that there was something seriously wrong enough to him and his brother Wayne to go to the police in Humboldt County, to the sheriff's office.
Right.
Tell us what happens. Give us. It's a fascinating story. That he calls his brother and says, I've hurt some people, something to that effect. Tell us a little bit more about that in the actual, because it's very important. It's very important to the trial. It's very important to anybody even knowing this story.
Right.
At least some people were to say that. I think you even say that in the book. Other people have said that. Give us those details. It's a fascinating account of those very, very important events that happened in the next few days, but especially from the time he calls his brother.
Okay, so he calls his brother's house. Actually, his brother's at work. Talks to his brother's wife, and he basically just says, he gets Rodney to call. Really, I'll just read you the quote. He says, "I'm in some real bad trouble, and I think the police are looking for me. I need your help. I need you to come get me." So it was that already, by the time that they finally connected, Rodney had actually quit his job that day and had already driven a really long way, commuting back and forth 5 hours, and he ended up having to drive yet another 5 hours to get to where his brother was at the Ocean Grove Lodge in the seaside town of Trinidad, California, which is Humboldt County. So he drove and drove and drove. He gets there at 1 in the morning, and this is off the Coastal Highway 101 for anybody who is living in Northern California. And it's a really beautiful area with a lot of really tall redwoods, some are 200, 300 feet tall. And the lodge is like some cabins. And the cabin where Wayne was staying is actually called Room 0 because it used to be a barbershop and something else, and they ended up converting it. So it ended up becoming a new room, but they'd run out of numbers, I guess, so they called it Room 0.
Right.
So he shows up at 1 in the morning, and Wayne just looks like hell. He's all ragged and frazzled looking, hasn't showered, and looks like he hasn't really slept, and he's just crying and crying, and Rodney doesn't really understand. He's like, well, what's going on? And Wayne is crying. He's like, I'm glad you're here. I really needed you to be here. I really wanted your help. But he kept going off on these jags, and Rodney kept trying to understand. He's basically just rambling and babbling about all kinds of things about their childhood and about, why was his dad so mean and why did our mom leave us? Because they both feel that their mom abandoned them, and the mother feels that it was more the other way around. So, it's hard to know who to believe, but essentially they both had to get out of her house. So you could look at it either way. And he says, well, I love you. I care about you. I'm here. And, Rodney knew that Wayne, was emotional, but this was even more emotional for him than he'd ever seen. And he started talking about how he missed his boy Max, who is, a couple years old. He had been divorced, and there was a custody battle, but Wayne actually really didn't fight that hard. So Elizabeth, the wife, kept the kid, and Wayne was only allowed to see him every once in a while, but he really didn't even try that hard. But in his own mind, he felt like he wasn't being allowed to see his son. So he was complaining about that, and he says, I miss my boy, I can't see my boy. And if you talk to, the wife doesn't see it that way. It's like, well, why doesn't he ever try to come and see him, Anyway, and then he says, I hurt some people. I don't want to hurt anybody anymore. And Rodney says, you hurt some people? And he says, yeah. So Rodney's thinking, well, what do you mean? You got in a bar fight, or did you break someone's arm? But Wayne wouldn't give him any details. So he says, I'm here to help. I want to help you. And Wayne says, well, I want to go to the sheriff's. I want to turn myself in. So, Rodney didn't know. He was so tired at that point. He just felt like, well, something is weird, but let's just deal with it in the morning. So they get up in the morning. Wayne goes and gets his shower, finally cleans up, seems more like himself. He's in a pretty good mood. He's like, well, let's go to Denny's. So they go to Denny's, and he still doesn't want to talk about this. So Rodney's trying to bring it up. Who did you hurt? What are you talking about? Wayne says, I don't want to talk about that right now. Look, I just want to spend the day with you. He wants to go through memory lane. So he wants to go see the places where they grew up, where they used to hang out, that kind of thing. And again, he's still doing fine 1 minute, doing the crying jag the next minute.
Okay.
So his mood's shooting up and down, and Rodney tries again. He's like, how did you hurt some people? He says, well, if I tell you, you won't love me. You'll hate me. And Rodney says, well, I love you. I'm your brother. And he says, well, I hurt some people bad, and they don't have to worry about anything anymore. So now that suddenly sounds really ominous. So
Sure.
Rodney starts getting really worried. Now he's not only worried what Wayne has done, but now he's worried that Wayne has dragged him into something that is going to get him in trouble too.
Okay.
So he's trying to figure out what to do next. They go to see a movie, and it's getting late in the day, and Rodney's like, let's just go to the sheriff's office. So on the way there, Wayne decides he doesn't want to go anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably why he called his brother, because it's hard to turn yourself in. You're going to be put away for the rest of your life. I have to say that's got to be hard for anybody.
Sure.
But anyway, Rodney's like, well, no, we've come this far. We're going. So anyway, I'm going to leave some of this stuff out because we don't need to go into every single detail. But they get to the sheriff's office, and Rodney goes to the woman behind the glass, the reception center, and basically says, my brother wants to turn himself in. He's hurt people, doesn't want to hurt anyone anymore. She's just like, what's that about? Looks up on the computer. He has no criminal record. Wants to talk to Wayne. Wayne says the same thing. And so they're kind of confused because, he's not giving anybody any details. So one of the officers comes out, and then a sergeant comes out. And, there's a couple different versions of what happened next. Rodney has one version, and the sheriffs have another version. But one way or another, either Wayne or the sheriff's deputies pulled this baggie out of Wayne's jacket pocket and pulled it out, and it's kind of leaking, and it looks like a piece of raw chicken. And he turns it over, and it's got a nipple on it, and they suddenly realize what they're holding, and they just basically are like, wow, this is awful. And so, he wants to turn himself in, so they're going to take him back, and they arrest him on aggravated mayhem, essentially, which is the involuntary removal of a body part.
Right.
And anyway, then he gets taken off and taken back until they're waiting for the homicide detective to come in so that he can start questioning him. And that's pretty much what happened in the lobby.
Amazing. Now,
yeah.
What, just for people that might be curious, and I would be if I was listening to this story so far, has there been a body found with its breast cut off? Is there a serial killer?
Yeah, this was kind of confusing, I think, for them at first because there was a case about a year earlier that this detective that they called in from home to come, they said, hey, this might be a lead on your torso case because they had found a torso, not they, but some boaters had found a torso in an area called Ryan Slough, which is a tributary on the way to the ocean. And the breasts were cut off, but you could still tell, that it was a woman's torso. And then about, I don't remember the exact timeline now, but actually I did write it down. Here we go. 3 months later, on the beach, an arm was found, and they did a DNA test and found that it was the same person. So we don't have a head, and we don't have we have a torso, and we have an arm. So... Okay. Clearly, this body has been cut up, and they're, being found in different places. But so this detective has been basically looking for the past year for, contacting other, authorities all over the country, looking for missing people who would fit some sort of. They could sort of tell, I think, the basic age of this girl.
Right.
And so they called this detective to come in, and he started asking him about these things. So he kind of had a feeling that this breast might be from that victim, but it turned out not to be.
Now, the thing is, when they went into the courthouse, the sheriff's office, there was, it later becomes an issue because obviously there's an issue of Miranda rights,
right?
Which is basically, if people want to know, it's does the client or the defendant basically ask for a lawyer, and then all of the normal questioning of that defendant, of this accused, would end. So they really wouldn't be able to interview him about almost anything at all because a lawyer would rightly advise that that person should say nothing. So tell us really what the bone of contention was without going into the trial, but tell us what you have found. I mean, there was always...
It's very complicated, and I could probably talk about an hour on this, so I'll try to keep it short. But basically, he did ask for a lawyer, okay? He's in the lobby. He asked for a lawyer. During the interview with Juan Freeman, he asked for a lawyer. So the detective basically said, are you sure? And he said, yeah. So they had to stop the interview.
Right.
So anyway, the detective went to Rodney, who was still waiting in the station to find out, what's going on, and talked to Rodney, and I have the transcript, which I put in the book, but essentially he said, we're not going to be able to help these families get closure. We're not going to be able to know if there's any victims, who are in danger right now that he might have taken and put somewhere. And these are some of the things going through Rodney's head also. And there's this weird conversation. So Juan basically asks Juan Freeman, the detective, asks Rodney to talk to Wayne and say, would you, can you talk without a lawyer to help the police, and help these families? So there's this weird, I have this transcript where Rodney and Wayne are having this conversation, and it's like, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but apparently they seem to understand each other. It's kind of, they're talking back and forth in these very short, clipped, partial sentences. And I don't know whether Rodney and Wayne were actually communicating, or maybe Wayne didn't understand what Rodney was saying, but since Rodney didn't know the whole story, he's trying to advise Wayne to do the right thing and do what God would want you to do and this and that. But I know from talking to Rodney that he did want Wayne to be protected, under the law. So I don't really know exactly, but the bottom line is Wayne, from that conversation, thought that Rodney was telling him to talk without a lawyer, so he did. But Wayne had the idea that he was going to get a lawyer, so he was clearly confused. And the defense argued that he thought he was going to be getting an attorney. But, however, the fact that he had asked for an attorney at first, and they had stopped the interview when he had asked for an attorney again. Right. He then started talking without an attorney. He agreed to talk without an attorney, and he continued to talk for the next few days. And so over the years, they wrangled over this in court because, you can see, if you see the booking video, he's crying, he's upset, he's clearly not in a rational state. And, right. And the defense, when they had these hearings, they called a psychologist who said, look, he's clearly confused. He doesn't seem to understand what's going on. And later on, when he kept saying, where's my attorney, it's clear that he thought one was coming. Sure. That he was going to tell them some things, but he was still going to get help and be protected and get an attorney. So he clearly did not understand what was going on, because otherwise he wouldn't keep asking for the attorney. And so eventually, when this got to the judge at the end, they did end up throwing out some of the interviews toward the end where he kept asking for the attorney, because it was clear that he was confused. However, the early ones, where he talked with detectives from these various counties where these victims were from, they left those in. So there are some people who've heard this story and read this book who think that was not fair. And there are some people who say, well, you know what, he waived his right, he kept talking. And it does seem that he does want to help the authorities. See, that's the thing. It's hard to tell how much did he understand, how much did he really want to confess. And, it's just hard to tell, and I can't really make a judgment on that, but it is clear that he's confused. So,
what I was surprised with, and maybe you can tell me, did the defense Is it permissible what the police did in their conversation with Rodney Ford, and then getting Rodney Ford to talk to the brother? You say there was some talk, and they did talk about the vulnerability or the mental state, unstable mental state, while they were questioning him. Not to much avail, obviously, but I thought it would be interesting. Is it permissible what they really did?
It's been adjudicated in court, and they had a number of hearings on this, I'm sure, over the years. I mean, I know they did. But here's something that I thought was really, I'll use the word curious. The defense attorney, one of the public defenders up in Humboldt County, actually did go to the jail to see Wayne, so that he, and they wouldn't let him in. And I'm not sure why this didn't ever go anywhere, but he claims that he went to the jail and said, "I'm here to see Wayne," and they said he's not available. So I don't understand how that was allowed, frankly, because, apparently he was being interrogated. That's why he wasn't available.
Sure.
So this guy ended up, I think it was, a weekend or something, and he wasn't able to get to a judge in time. But by the time he did get to see, his client, it was too late. He'd already, given several days of these confessions.
Sure.
So I don't understand why that didn't get anywhere in court, but they did adjudicate this, and like I said, the judge did end up throwing some of them out, but not the early ones. So
right.
There you go.
Now you talk about the confession per se. What exactly did the police get from him? Obviously, they had a breast, they had this body that they were trying to link to him, but they got much more detail from Wayne Adam Ford eventually. Tell us what they did get from him eventually.
It's actually almost easier to tell you what they didn't get, but what they didn't get was exactly how he killed them, because he wouldn't admit to that. But you got everything else. So he said, "I picked up this woman, at this place. Here's what she was wearing. Here's what I did." Basically, it was a pretty common thing, set of activities, if you want to call it that. He generally picked up prostitutes. Not all of these women were prostitutes, but most of them were. One of them, who was not ever arrested for prostitution, certainly seemed to be moving in that direction, although they didn't categorize her that way. She was letting men, touch her breasts for money, and so, it seemed to be going in that direction anyway.
Sure.
But he basically would pick up women, whether they were prostitutes or just vulnerable women who were on drugs or drinking, but vulnerable, and get them in his truck and, ask them, do you date, or, how much do you charge, or whatever. So they would, tell them how much they charged, or maybe they just wanted to ride. The first victim that they never identified, he didn't say she was a prostitute, so I think she was just a troubled soul wandering, probably hitchhiking. So he would pick up hitchhikers to women. He would get a rope or a tie, a man's dress tie, and choke them with it, and make them pass out. Now, I don't know if any of these women or some of these women agreed to this or not, but the one who survived and testified claims she did not agree to that type of activity. Things weren't going well. He would start doing things to them, torturing them. He'd burn their genitals with a cigarette lighter, nasty stuff, hit them with a belt buckle down there. And yet later, when he was in these quote-unquote confessions, he would leave some of that nasty stuff out. So he would tell them, yes, we were having sex, but it was consensual. I was strangling, he didn't say strangle them, I was cutting off their, basically their air and their carotid artery, because they had a more intense orgasm that way. And so this was for their pleasure. So, it's unclear. Was he lying? Did he really believe this? I don't know. But clearly it's an aberrant behavior. He's hurting them. He's causing them to pass out. He's bringing them back with CPR 3 or 4 times. And they're, frightened out of their minds and crying. And scared, obviously, and so he won't say exactly that he killed them, but he just says, well, I couldn't bring them back, or she stopped breathing, and I tried to give her CPR, but I just couldn't bring her back. And that's kind of that's his confession. So, but he claimed essentially that it was an accident. This was sex they were having. He paid them, and this was for their pleasure. And then I tried to bring them back, but I just couldn't. And
yeah, he had the convenient amnesia just for the specific details of the actual murder and the, like you say, the torture.
Right, and his attorneys claimed that he couldn't remember it, and of course the prosecutor was saying, well, of course he remembered it, but he didn't want to admit that he remembered it. So it's unclear. Did he remember it? Did he not remember it? I don't know, but he didn't admit to remembering it. So.
Now, was there, you talk about a well-known FBI behavioral science unit criminal profiler named PARTS-author. Was he consulted in this case? Was the FBI consulted in this case for what they could find out about the serial killer profile and the behavior of serial killers?
That I don't. I think they were. The FBI was brought in, I believe, or at least they were consulted early on. And I've written 3 books since I wrote this, and I can't remember every single detail, but I do seem to remember that they were consulted on that torso case before Wayne was arrested. I don't believe they were consulted after he was arrested. That's my memory serves. So PARTS-author was consulted by the prosecution, and since this took such a long time to get to court, they ended up paying him quite a bit of money over the years to get ready for trial. So, and he doesn't actually work for the FBI. He is a consultant, and
right.
He's one of those guys that goes around and testifies at trials, and he actually also testified in the trial about the serial killer that I ended up writing about. That I'm still finishing a book on now, which is coming out next year, called Dead Reckoning, about Skylar DeLeon. So. Oh,
great! And when's that out again? Did you say?
It's coming out in February 2011. Same publisher. But anyway, he was also brought in on that case as well. So this is something that he does on a regular. That's what he does for a living.
Right. Now, you said that Wayne Ford was seen by psychologists, and obviously at the trial there was the defense is one of the only things they can use in the defense would be his mental state. Tell us a little bit about that. When the psychologists did see Wayne Adam Ford, what was their diagnosis?
Well, okay, so it's hard to say how many psychologists he was seen by, but it was a number of them. He was represented by a different attorney than the one who actually saw him through trial. So it started up in Humboldt County with that public defender that I mentioned who tried to go see him in the jail. They actually were moving in a different direction for a different defense, which was more of an addled brain defense, that there was something structurally wrong, abnormalities in his brain.
Right.
So they had, and I don't know a lot about that because I wasn't able to get that information, but I do know that he was seen by other psychologists. Then he got new attorneys when they brought the case down to San Bernardino and consolidated all 4 of these murders into, from different counties. There were 2 from San Bernardino County, 1 from Kern County, 1 from San Joaquin County, where these bodies were found and where the victims were from. They ended up consolidating the prosecution under a new law called the Rainey Law in San Bernardino County. So he was then sent down there, and he got a new public defender who then had him see some new psychologists. So I'm going to tell you what that one, Dr. Reed Malloy, what he found.
Sure.
It's pretty complicated, but there's a lot of stuff here. He found that he, had depression, that he was an alcoholic, and that he was, using, beer to escape, essentially. That he had an antisocial and borderline personality disorder with impulsive and explosive features. That he was a sexual sadist and a masochist, and had a number of what we call paraphilias, which sexual sadism and masochism fits under. But paraphilias such as pickerism, which is poking body parts with a needle, which in his case was the breast. He was fixated on the breast also, which was, I think it's called, I'm trying to find the page here because I have them all listed, partialism, I believe, where you focus on one body part. Yeah, partialism is an intense focus on one body part for sexual arousal. And then isolated incidents of pseudo-necrophilia, or sex with a corpse. So, some pretty gross stuff. Also, periods of acute psychosis. When he was in the military, he decompensated a couple times. They had to use restraints and give him Haldol, and he was just going nuts. I mean, just really aggressive. And they actually put in his medical records, which I also was able to get. That was another set of documents that I was able to get from the evidence, his Marine medical records, because he was in the Marine Corps, that he had actually been described as catatonic. So periods of acute psychosis where he would just kind of disintegrate. And then they also did some brain scans and found some brain abnormalities with some atrophy in the cerebellum, which is the part of the brain that does coordination and that sort of thing, and that his brain was kind of, if you have to use a metaphor, kind of running on fewer cylinders than it's supposed to. Now, this could be genetic. This could be from the alcohol. They weren't sure, but there was definitely something structurally wrong with his brain. And in addition to that, he was in this severe accident, I guess you could call it. He was on the freeway with his then girlfriend, who became his wife, and they saw a car accident on the side of the road on the freeway. And he said, after being in the Marines, he had learned CPR and learned some other first aid techniques. And curiously, he was taught essentially about the carotid arteries and the various parts of the neck so all this information he later used to kill people. At this point, he actually used the same knowledge to try to save somebody. So there was the passenger in this car accident was bleeding profusely from the neck. So he's actually holding this artery that he later used to kill these women. He's holding this guy, his neck, to stop him from bleeding to death, when a drunk driver comes and hits him and knocks him 40 feet down an embankment. So half his jaw and his face were kind of torn off, severe head injury. He also had a head injury when he was a little boy. So anyway, clearly some head trauma, and they've done studies and found that many of the people on death row have had serious head trauma, so it can change you. So sure. All of those things were found either, mental or emotional problems or structural problems in Wayne's brain.
So despite all this well-documented evidence of mental illness, how did it fare at the trial? What happened at the trial in the end?
Well, basically, and this is pretty common for a defense and prosecution to take these sides. Essentially, what it breaks down to is the defense says he didn't have a choice. He had these problems. Some of them were genetic, environmental, structural problems, and the prosecution says no, he did have a choice, even though they were brought up in the same home. His brother didn't end up killing anybody. He was fine. The depression that was in the military, documented in the military records, Dietz was saying, well, I think he could have been faking some of those symptoms. And basically that prompted a false diagnosis of psychosis. Yes, he was a sexual sadist, but just because he has these urges doesn't mean he has to satisfy them by hurting anybody. He could have fantasized or simulated these acts with a consenting partner. So he did have a choice. He didn't have to do this. And, he was seeking out people to kill. Now, the main point of contention was that the defense expert psychologist said he wasn't looking for people to kill. He was looking for people to have these aberrant sexual activities with, and in the process, they ended up dying, whereas the prosecution expert was saying he was a predator going out looking for these people to kill. Or, if even short of that, if he knows after, the first time or the second time that these women are dying when he's giving them CPR and they don't come back, he has to know the ramifications of his actions. Why does he keep doing it? He clearly knew the consequences of his act.
Yeah, it's clear that even though he exhibits all kinds of things that people would consider insane, by the strict definition by law, because he covers up elements of his crime and evades capture, then he is technically not insane.
Well, they didn't actually try for an insanity defense. They just said, try to put yourself in his brain. It doesn't work properly. He isn't seeing things right. Think about if you went to a party and drank a whole lot and tried to make decisions, his brain is not working properly. So his decision making, he's distorting things. He's seeing things his perceptions are off. He's got this borderline personality disorder, and he just twists things in his own mind. He's paranoid. He's very dependent on these women, and he loves them one minute and detaches from them the next. And this is all part of his psychosis and psychopathy. So yeah, there's definitely, you could argue both ways, but the prosecution always argues no, he had a choice. So that's pretty much the deal.
Now the trial, the complexion of the trial changes just because there is a death penalty available. So basically the lawyers have to go and defend against that inevitability rather than anything else. There is no ability to have much of a plea bargain, but this is a death penalty case. Tell us a little bit more about what happened at that death penalty case and what was the end result in it. Okay. I know that you could talk a little bit about that it took a considerable time to get to trial. 7 years is quite a length of time to get to trial.
Yeah, well, a lot of that was wrangling over these confessions and whether they should be admitted or not and all kinds of other things. Basically, the trial went on for months, and part of the reason it went on for so long is because the defense kept trying to put on family members and various other people, and then the judge kept saying no. So it just delayed things longer than it might have otherwise. But by the time they found him guilty, and then what they do in the death penalty portion is the jury is asked to weigh mitigating circumstances against aggravating circumstances. So
right.
The mitigating circumstances would be, well, he turned himself in, he had this head injury, he had these issues when he was growing up. One thing I do want to mention, which I think is a really big contributor, I don't know exactly when this happened, but his mother basically told him that he was a product of rape, so that his own father had raped his mother to produce him.
Oh, that's right.
And I think that's a pretty important fact as well. So, all that gets considered by the jury. But this jury did not take into, well, they took into account, but I'm just saying that they were not persuaded or convinced that they should show him, any less punishment because he actually, even though he turned himself in and tried to help authorities identify his victims and showed them on maps where he picked up the women and where he put their bodies and confessed to all that and helped them identify these people and get their families closure. The jury was not convinced about that, and I've talked to some people, readers, who actually feel that, that's a shame, that, why do we have a system like this where there's a possibility, why turn yourself in then, and try to help people if you're not going to get anything for it. But this particular jury, they're in a very conservative county, and that they weren't swayed by that. So, and it didn't take that long for them to come around to their decision. So I think, and basically what the judge said when he confirmed their findings at the sentencing is, maybe the first one was an accident, maybe even the second one was an accident, but by the time you get to the third and the fourth time that you're bringing these women back with CPR and they don't come back, you know what you're doing. So, nobody's buying this accident defense anymore here.
There were, if I'm not incorrect, a couple women that almost were killed by Wayne Ford. And in your book, you talk about when these people came forward. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or at least one of the victims, and what she had to say?
Yeah, Rachel Holt, who I actually got permission from directly to use her name because, generally we don't, as journalists, don't identify names of rape victims, certainly if they don't want that. But she agreed to let me use her picture and identify her in the book. But she was a prostitute, and to this day, to my knowledge, is still working as a prostitute. And she got picked up by him, and like I said, got tied up, and he hit her with the belt buckle. That's how we know this, in the genitals while he was driving. Kept telling her to shut up, but she was crying. And anyway, when he let her go, though, he let her out of the truck and tied her actually loosely. So she was able, as soon as the truck drove away, he tied her up so that it would take her a while to get loose, so that she couldn't, report him or whatever. Well, she did. She got loose, and she crawled up the ravine and, had someone pick her up, and she went and she, called and reported it. And she was, taken to a hospital so they could do a rape kit and look at her injuries. And she was still really upset. And she ultimately did a sketch for the sketch artist. And then after Wayne turned himself in, she identified him from a photo lineup. There was another prostitute who he picked up and did some similar things to down in Orange County, which is the other end of the state. So he's a trucker, just driving up and down. She was not ultimately able to testify at trial, even though she had a similar story, because she was too strung out on meth and she just wasn't a good witness. So those two, they both reported it, and they were both telling similar stories.
So Rachel Holt's testimony, with signifying some of the, inevitable signatures of this serial killer.
Right, exactly.
That must have been important to the trial itself.
It was. Yeah, and the defense actually, though, was pretty brutal to her. She told me that it was the most horrible experience, because basically she gets raped, and then she gets on the stand, and the defense is, essentially emotionally raping her again by making her, calling her a liar and taking her through a bunch of other, more minor infractions, lying to the police about this or that, and so why isn't she lying now, and, that kind of thing. But the thing is that her story was pretty consistent with the injuries of these that were found on the bodies of these other victims. So in the end, the jury believed her, I think. Did you have the impression, or did you find out as evidence that she thought it was a favorable experience overall? Favorable? What do you mean? Well, I mean, it was worthwhile for her to do this, despite all the... Horrible. She said it was horrible being on trial. And, the way that I talked to her, and I just said, you were really important in this trial in helping get him convicted. So, I'd really like to use your story in here. And so she agreed. So, but she claimed, it really wasn't that bad. It was actually worse to be on trial, because she said she had put it behind her and she had moved on. But it was actually almost worse to be on trial than it was to be raped, which I don't personally believe. But well, certainly sometimes what I found is, from my personal experience and from just looking at these stories for a few years, is that the media is not very fair to a person that's brave enough to come forward, especially like a woman in this kind of case has been raped, to come forward. They're risking a certain amount of the inevitable cross-examination. The media adds insult to injury sometimes by taking too much of what the defense has to say as gospel. I mean, Well, I basically just used the court transcripts, and I just told the story of what happened in court. So I don't make any judgment. I just put it out there what she claimed happened. So right. So where is Wayne Ford right now? He's awaiting. He is on death row at San Quentin Prison in Northern California, and he's something like, I don't know, number 680 in line, and there's, I think, 700 inmates on death row, and nobody's been executed in California since 2006. So it's pretty likely, unless they start doing it like Texas, start up again and start doing it at a fast clip, he could easily just die in prison. So
right, one or the other, right? So
yeah, and that's they're studying the methods of carrying out the death penalty, and also how much it costs in California, because it's just too expensive for some of these counties to prosecute people, and some of the families really want that, and voters have passed that, but it's just extremely costly, and a lot of them are just going to die in prison anyway. But it just, as a taxpayer, the system is broken, at least in California, so it's just not working. If they want fast action, but these inmates don't even get to see their lawyer for at least 5 years. So I mean, the clock is just ticking, and we're having to pay to house these people and feed them and clothe them, and it takes longer to try them. There's so much more involved in a death penalty trial, because the judges and the attorneys are so much. They're not that they're not careful usually, but they dot every I and cross every T like 3 times, and they're so scared there's going to be an appeal, and it's just so much more costly. It just really is.
Yeah. Well, you've written a great book. It's called Body Parts.
Thank you.
Caitlin Rother. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. I know that you're a career journalist and author, and you have quite a few true crime books and nonfiction books under your belt as well. So maybe tell us about some of those books and a little bit about your background, please.
Sure. I was a daily newspaper reporter at mostly major metropolitan dailies for 19 years before I quit to write books full-time in 2006. While I was a reporter, I was covering actually a lot of government and politics. So that's a lot of what I did. But I was interested in writing human interest stories, and I kind of just slowly got more and more into covering bizarre crimes and bizarre deaths, essentially. So sometimes I would write about suicide. I was writing about mental illness. I was writing about prisons. I was writing about the mentally ill in prisons. So I actually got quite a bit of background while I was a reporter at the newspaper, not as a crime reporter, but more as an issue-oriented reporter. I was covering social services and mental health and the justice system, but not as a court reporter and not as a police reporter. Although on Saturdays, oftentimes, I would start doing more and more of these crimes, and I just sort of moved in that direction, and I kind of got tired of writing about politicians who lied to me, so I almost felt like this was cleaner in a way. Anyway, I got more and more into it, and my first entire criminal trial was the Kristen Rossum case in San Diego, a toxicologist for the medical examiner's office who poisoned her husband and with drugs she stole from the lab, and then staged a suicide scene and made it look like he had committed suicide because she was leaving him. So I covered that for the paper, and then I wrote a book about it. That's Poisoned Love. That's my first book. Meanwhile, I had been working on a novel, which has pretty similar themes. That's called Naked Addiction, also set in San Diego, with a surfing detective investigating a series of beauty school murders. Again, mental illness and, crimes and drugs and that sort of thing, similar to Poison Love. And then my third book is called Twisted Triangle, which is a account of the 2 married FBI agents, Margot and Jean Bennett, and a lesbian love affair with Patricia Cornwell, the famous crime novelist. Jean Bennett got upset about this, ended up kidnapping his wife right before she was going to testify against him for fraud. He ends up going to prison, is very angry, and ends up trying to kill Margot and her minister in a church. That's all true. And my next book was this one, Body Parts. And then the 5th one I co-authored. It's called Where Hope Begins, and It's actually been featured on Dr. Phil several times. It's kind of a complicated story, and I'm not going to be able to tell it in too much detail in the amount of time we have, but a TV reporter takes in the surviving female members of the Marcus Wesson mass murder. So 9 dead children ranging in age from babies to a 25-year-old found dead in a pile in the back bedroom of a house. Well, while the police were in the front yard, they were shot. Somehow didn't hear any shots. And she basically helped these women recover from this horrible experience and living under this in a cult-like atmosphere of incest and polygamy and abuse with this guy Marcus Weston, who basically ordered the murder of his own children because he wanted to keep the family together. And he said, well, I'll join you in heaven, but you guys stay together. I'm going to stay here. I've got some more work to do. But he had the oldest daughter shoot all the smaller children. It's horrible. Anyway.
Incredible.
And then my last one, which is coming out in February, which I'm just finishing up now, it's called Dead Reckoning, and it's the story of Skylar DeLeon, another, as it turns out to be a serial killer, even though he's not a sexual serial killer. He's in it for the money and for greed and to make his wife happy, essentially, because she wants things. So they're like the Bonnie and Clyde of Orange County, California. And they end up planning this whole thing, and Skylar and a couple other guys go out on this yacht and take the yacht owners out and tell them, that they want to buy the boat, when in fact they just want to steal the boat. So they tie these 2 people to an anchor, throw them overboard alive, and come back in and try to basically take these people's bank accounts and all their money, and it ends up not working. So then he tries to kill his father and his cousin by hiring inmates and their friends to kill them because he thinks they're going to testify against them.
Incredible.
So that's a pretty gruesome story, too.
Well, Caitlin, thank you very much for this incredible interview.
Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was my pleasure. You've been listening to the program True Murder with my special guest, Caitlin Rother, and we've been discussing her book, Body Parts. You have yourself a good evening, Caitlin.
You too.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Case, what was it that compelled you to decide to write this incredible story? And finally, what unprecedented access did you have? What information did you have that you were privy to?
Okay, let me start with the first question. It's funny, but I've always been fascinated with serial killers. There's a program on MSNBC that features an interview between Jeffrey Dahmer's parents.
I've seen that.
Seen that? I just get riveted when I watch that. Even if I've already seen it, I'll watch it again.
Yes.
But I never really thought that I was going to necessarily write about this, because to spend this much time in such a dark place, I knew was going to be difficult. But
sure.
Like watching an execution as a journalist, I thought it was something I wanted to do and should do if I'm going to write about this type of thing. So I actually decided, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do this one. But the specific reason I chose this case was that, it was grisly, but that he turned himself in. And I think that's it's not unprecedented, but it's pretty rare. And
sure.
The penalty phase.
Right.
So I went up for the penalty phase to San Bernardino County, which is a couple hours northeast of where I live here in San Diego. And I met all the players in court that day, and I went up to them and said, I'm interested in writing a book. Would you be willing to cooperate with me? And pretty much everybody in the courtroom that I talked to, the attorneys on both sides and the judge, and I got to know the clerk and found out, that I could actually look at some of the interviews that had been done, which became part of the evidence. And some of these interviews the judge would not admit, but they were still put into the evidence.
I see.
The jury did not get to hear these things or see these things, but I got to see them. That makes sense. So there was an interview with his mother, for example, that ended up not being presented in court, which was fascinating and really telling. And there were other interviews with his family members that nobody had ever heard from. But I built on that by gaining the trust of the defense investigator who talked to the father and the brother of Wayne Adam Ford and told them they had never been interviewed by anybody other than police and by the attorneys. So they'd never talked to the media. Apparently Dan Rather approached Gene Ford, the father, and he said no. So somehow I managed to get exclusive access to family members, both through my own interviews and I spent 2 days entire days in a hotel room talking with Gene Ford and Rodney Ford. So quite a lot of really interesting background information that was never revealed before.
Yes, I mean, you really cover the subject of this book and really get to his background and really cover both sides, which I thought was very unusual for most books where they didn't have access to that kind of information. So you gave both sides, and rather than trying to make a decision based on your own opinion,
right,
you just presented both those sides. And that gets me to this next question. The subject of your book is Wayne Adam Ford, and he goes by the name often Adam.
Right.
So what was Wayne Adam Ford's childhood really like?
I want to talk just for a second.
Good evening. You're listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. 36-year-old Wayne Adam Ford walked into the Humboldt County Sheriffs Office in Northern California with a woman's severed breast in his pocket. He ended up convicted of the grisly torture and murder of 4 women, confessing to police because he couldn't stop himself. Based on previously sealed testimony and interviews about the key players in the case, Body Parts is a frighteningly intimate look into a twisted man overcome by the horror of what he had become, powerless to resist that ever-increasing perverse sexual and murderous desires within him. With unprecedented access, my guest author, Caitlin Rother, reveals what exactly drove a troubled man to commit such unspeakable murders. Body Parts with author Caitlin Rother. Welcome to the program, Caitlin Rother, and I hope I'm pronouncing your last name properly.
It's actually Rother, but that's okay.
Okay, well, now I'll go on from that. Caitlin Rother, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, first off, what made you decide to write about this case? It is a particularly shocking...
The fact that he walked into the sheriff's office with this breast in a plastic bag is a pretty shocking detail that
sure
always makes people say, oh, wow, I want to know more. So it wasn't that I wanted the gruesome and gory stuff. I'm not that type of writer. I'm really more interested in the psychological types of cases.
Sure.
So this book is really a psychological look at this guy and his life, and how did he evolve and become this person who, did these horrible things, and what did he end up doing about it to stop? So.
Yes, and they did talk about the unprecedented access. So I just wanted to know. I mean, the book is incredible in its detail, and it covers every aspect of it. So you were privy to information
right.
via that access. So tell us what specific
sure.
people or players you had access to.
Okay. I went up. I did not go to the entire trial because I didn't know about the case until the very end of the trial, and I learned that he had been convicted. So I thought, oh, okay, well, I'm going to go up for the death penalty trial, because there's, in a death penalty trial, you have the guilt phase and then you have